No, and that's why largely I won't talk a lot about the historical Jesus, but the scholars who have a study around finding the historical Jesus, and that is, trying to determine what if Jesus was a real person, which is an openly debatable point.
Because there is no contemporary eyewitness evidence.
No.
I mean, these things. What is written about him is generally written by followers of Jesus long after his supposed death.
And the few secular sources we have are basically accounts of historians basically saying, there are these people called Christians, and they worshipped a guy named Christ who they thought was divine.
And that was Josephus there?
Flavius Josephus was the earliest mention, and then there was a Roman historian that's name is escaping me right now who talked about people who were named Christians. So
really doesn't say a lot.
So yeah, I mean we know about the existence of Christians existed because they exist now. Obviously, that's not very controversial. But other than the historical context, that to me is not necessarily as interesting as looking at the Bible in a literary context. In looking that it is the successor to the first literary Western religion, which was Judaism. Judaism was unique among other ancient religions in that it was a bookish religion, meaning they actually bothered to take their holy doctrine and write it down and keep this tradition with them, and they would slowly improve on them with the laws and what have you. The law and was it called the law and the prophets, the interpretations that came after the law. That was fairly unique, and the fact that the New Testament then carries on this tradition of being this written tradition where, although this was to be decided later with canon, it was where these traditions themselves were saved and collected together and made into a large body of authoritative work. That sets it apart as it is also a work of literature as well. They were all written by, not all of them, but they were written by different authors. Paul is largely accredited with writing a great number of them, but they weren't all written by the same person. They weren't written by the hand of God or Jesus. They were partially sourced from common text sources that no longer survive, that are also either derived directly or indirectly from oral tradition, because this is the way that stories got passed down in antiquity, because most people were illiterate. They were written for different audiences, and they were also written in a language that really was not spoken, read, or understood by the people who lived in those events. So the earliest copies of the Bible were undoubtedly in Greek, although people in Judea who were Jewish spoke Aramaic. That's the interesting part about this entire thing is although it was alleged to have been written by the disciples Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were peasant, illiterate fishermen and other people who had jobs who had jobs but didn't require any real education. So the fact that for it to require someone to have known how to read as well as write Greek to assemble these stories as part of one of the eyewitnesses makes it highly unlikely that these are homonymous, which is written by the same author as it is credited with. It makes it highly unlikely that these are homonymous books.
They're more written in the name of something rather
correct.
than, this isn't the actual disciple who wrote this.
There's a $5 word called pseudepigraphic, which is exactly describing that. A book that is claimed to have been written by one person, but really is written by another. Also called a forgery.
I think George W. Bush has a book like that. Peggy Noonan actually wrote.
Yeah. Well, at least these are a little bit different in that the authors who wrote them decided to ascribe them to earlier works either out of respect for the tradition or in an attempt to gain more authenticity to the narrative itself.
I find it sort of funny, too, in the question of what language these texts were written in, that the Vatican, especially for the longest time, demanded that they be written in Latin, when clearly that isn't the original language that these things are from.
And most of the translations of the Bible that we had in the West came from the Latin Vulgate, which was an all-Latin version of the Old and New Testament that had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but when they actually started in the 19th century, when they actually started going back and trying to find the earliest sources, trying to pick them out, they found that the Vulgate was one of the ones that contained the most errors out of the surviving sources, where there were Greek assemblages that were a little more historically correct.
So essentially we have basically a really long game of telephone.
Right, and we'll definitely get to that when we talk about that. But the last thing to sort of understand about the Bible as in this literary context is that it survives now as a series of books that were copied dozens, if not hundreds of times over their lifetime between different languages. And in each of those copyings, they were subject to either innocent errors, copying errors, just regular human errors, to motivated and malicious changes. So there was all these things that happened that we now have no record of, other than the fact that we've got an early source here that that survived, and there's some changes between our earlier sources, and we really don't know what's original. We can sort of work around and try to see what's original, but we don't. So what I really want to address with these, and this is, I'm stealing entirely from Bart Ehrman, who's got a great book called Jesus Interrupted, where he talks about the literary traditions of the book itself, is that, while I reject wholeheartedly the theological and truth claims of most of these books, I think that they are far more interestingly have some value as historical accounts, and have even more value as looking as far as a foundation for our Western culture. Because obviously, you can't, like for example, Western philosophy, you can't help but have to be in on the joke, have to know exactly about the Christian mythology and the books to understand larger points that authors are trying to make.
Well, there's a lot of literary references too that get made. You call somebody a Judas goat, or you call someone a good Samaritan. I mean,
right.
These are all phrases that have biblical origins.
Right.
And I think on some level it's impossible to understand a lot of Western literature without having a basic understanding of the Bible, at least.
Right.
Where you know where a lot of phrases come from, what this is a metaphor for.
Right. So it looks like we're totally burning the daylight hours here. The 3 points that he wanted to get by were specifically is that, one, because of the fact that these were all written by different people, and if you actually set down I didn't have a good way to illustrate this to you guys, but if you set them out, if you read it horizontally, which is basically you take the texts themselves and you lay the passages side by side when they're talking about, for example,
whether the Last Supper happened before or after Passover.
Right. You could basically, by finding, because they all share the same they share lots of the same sources. For example, this is one part that I wanted to get to. If we look at a textual analysis of the Gospels themselves, you get a bulk of the tradition from the text of the book of Mark, which is the earliest source, and also from this lost source that we call Q, which is from, I believe it's Klele is the name you say it. It's a German word for source. Biblical scholars say that Q is this lost source of text by which large portions of Matthew and Luke take from word for word. So actually, if you lay down various parts of stories next to each other, they match almost exactly in almost all places, and they match very closely to Mark. So these were sources that were related. And of course, there were some literary sources unique to Matthew and Luke themselves, and those were given the monikers of M and L. And then John is based on a much, much later tradition. But essentially what you have is that they're all of course working from the same root oral tradition, because obviously someone carried on the life and stories of Jesus Christ after he died through oral traditions. But then you have these now non-existent textual sources for which what we see now is a pastiche of you're grabbing this from here, and these two are shared here, this one differs a little, and then some of these are some strange tradition that we don't have any source for. Like, for example, I believe it's in Matthew, there's the story that is most biblical scholars say can't have been original, which is the story about the prostitute being stoned to death. Mm-hmm. Essentially, that was I believe it was the one that gives, for he who was without sin cast the first stone. By looking back on earlier versions of the Bible, they now biblical scholars say that this was this was definitely an addition to the text. It was not part of the original text. So, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say we also have a voicemail line. If we could bring that up again real quick. We had it up a little bit earlier. Maybe closer to the end of the show where we can't actually do any more live calls, but we have a voicemail line. And it's 206-420-0997. Leave us a call, and we can definitely address your points. We can even play the call over the air next time. Definitely.
Right. So the last thing I had written down here, because there's so much more that I could go through here. I mean, the points that Ehrman wants to get across that I think are the most important is that, one, that the Bible as an inerrant text can't be true because it contains too many of its own. It's too self-contradictory in if if it's supposed to be a history, a literal history. And that 2, each author speaks for himself. Each book of the Synoptic Gospels, as well as each book of the rest of the New Testament, is done by a different author for a different community, and it wants to tell the same story but tell it differently. And thirdly, the most important is that looking at it from a historical perspective, these can't be disinterested historical accounts, because each person taking these traditions and writing them down and carrying them forward has an agenda for doing so. And largely, since these were written for various communities, these are largely ways to preserve the tradition, but as well as to interpret the tradition to help resolve some of the issues that the communities themselves might be having over time.
It's a way of selling it to a certain group. It's kind of like how Christianity in Europe adopted a lot of the pagan traditions from Saturnalia to convert people.
Correct. And I think the interesting part about here is that what we do find in to combat this sort of the weird errors between the inconsistencies between these stories is these apologetics, which is this whole field of trying to find a way to reconcile the fact that, say, Jesus died before Passover and after Passover, and you called it the
no prize for Jesus.
Right.
The general gist, if you're not familiar with what a no prize is, Marvel Comics used to do this thing where if a reader would call in and find a way to rationalize a continuity error, let's just say Spider-Man's eating a Reuben sandwich, and in some old issue he said he hated Reuben sandwiches, and they make some excuse for why this still fits. It's different in a lot of ways from Marvel Comics, simply because nobody who's coming up with these excuses really thinks Spider-Man is real. At least I hope not. The difference here is that really, and Sam put this out too, is apologetics largely exists not to try to convince other people of continuity errors, but largely to combat doubt within oneself. Largely, it's one of the most dishonest things I've seen, because the reasons they give for why other people should believe these things, even with the contradictions, aren't the reasons they believe. So
yeah, and so apologetics can be distasteful to a lot of people and some fun to bandy around for us. But I guess to conclude here of where I'm sort of taking this analysis from is not that I really care about what is historically true and untrue. I mean,
I do care.
I mean, let's just put it this way: it doesn't matter to me whether or not Jesus existed or didn't exist.
That I can agree with.
What matters is the fact that there are people that are credulous enough to believe that all the things that the Bible says are true. What our goal, I think, here should be to do is to continue to. Oh shoot, we got to call out. Sorry.
Anyways,
the Bible is awesome. You should read it.
Not really true though. We are going to be meeting in just a short while at the Northgate Azteca. Join us for some food, some fun, conversation. We continue this conversation soon. We do want to thank you here at Ask an Atheist. We'll be here next Sunday to discuss all sorts of topics. Come down, have a beer with us. See you next week.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.